Hello and welcome to Happy You Asked, the podcast where we explore joy one awkward conversation at a time. And I am your host, Erin Clare. With me today is Dr. Catherine Sanderson. Dr. Sanderson is the Polar Family Professor of Psychology at Amherst College, with degrees from Princeton and Stanford, and a sought-after keynote speaker whose talks translate the science of happiness, mindset, emotional intelligence, and moral courage into practical strategies for thriving at work and in life. The author of The Positive Shift and Why We Act, and a widely viewed TEDx speaker, she has been named one of the nation's top 300 professors by the Princeton Review, which honestly, Captain Sanderson, I didn't know was a thing. And now I feel like I have to have, I mean, suddenly I had jealousy. I was like, congratulations on that and
I,
for teaching me
I
that.
didn't know it was a thing either when they asked me. So I literally thought it was some kind of like a scam. So
Yeah,
I
yeah, like
I
who's
share
who.
your surprise. But anyway,
That must have been cool though that day.
it will. I'll tell you the story. But briefly, literally, I got an email saying I'd been chosen and would I fill out this form. And I literally did think it was a scam. Like I literally thought it was, and then we're gonna want you to do this
Hey,
donation or buy the book or
$350. And then,
right, exactly. And so I deleted it. And then about 2 weeks later, I got the same email again saying I hadn't filled out the form yet and could I please do so? And I again deleted it. And about 24 hours later, I got a call from Amherst College's public relations department or communications department. And they were like, we know you're really busy, but we'd really like you to fill out the form. And I was like, oh, this is a thing. And so apparently they knew and it was a thing. So, but that was how dubious I was that it was a scam. So,
I love that story. I would have done the exact same thing. I'd
right?
be like, they said, oh, that's real? That's real?
Yeah, that was it. I was really embarrassed because, but again, you would get a lot of scams these days, and
Oh,
so
yeah,
I was very suspicious.
I love that. So, thank you so much for being here. Welcome, welcome. And you get the same first question as everybody. What is your definition of happiness?
Oh boy, it's a great question, and I will say honestly, it has changed over time, and depending on the day that you ask me, it might even have changed in that way. But what I'm going to say right now for me, and this is again, I'm an academic and we're talking in July. But so what I'm going to say, happiness for me is control over my schedule such that I can do things that I want to do. And I will say that sort of element, and I give that sort of confusing answer because I think lots of times we think about happiness in these sort of big lofty ways, doing meaningful things or, going to Paris or, whatever. But honestly, what I love about the summer as an academic is my control over what do I want to do today? Do I want to talk about happiness? Do I want to get in my pool? Do I want to sit and read a book or take my dogs for a walk or whatever? So for me, happiness is really about control over how I get to spend my time and my days.
I love that. And of course, I don't get to do that now that I'm not a
Sorry.
professor anymore.
Sorry, I maybe that was a bad answer to give a dean.
No, not at all. I made my choice. I don't regret it. But yes, that freedom, even if it is more limited, is
Hmm.
absolute heaven.
Hmm.
Absolute heaven. I agree completely. So, you spent your career studying a lot of social norms, and I find this fascinating. What people actually think versus what we assume they think. When did you first realize how big this gap between those two things is?
So what's so interesting, and I know you were a professor, that was your identity for many years. So this will probably really resonate with you. But that idea first really occurred to me when talking with an undergraduate student, and so as a professor, one of the joys, of course, is getting to work with students. And sometimes ideas come from students that I've never thought about before. But all of a sudden, I'm like, huh, how interesting. So I was a graduate student at Princeton. I was working with John Darley, who's a pretty famous social psychologist, often known as the founder of the bystander effect. Some of your listeners may have heard of.
Hmm.
And we were supervising a student on her honors thesis. And as a graduate student, of course, that work fell to me. And she said, I believe that women are much less concerned about body image than they think other women are. And so she really had this idea that individually, she didn't really care that much about how she looked, but that she really felt that other women did. And that belief that
Mm-hmm.
other women did was driving her own behavior. And so she really had this interesting observation about social norms in the dining hall, eating and exercise on a college campus, and that she believed lots of people were wrong about it. And that was literally the prompt for what has been a lot of my research. We studied that for her thesis. We found that that was true. It was published, and that sort of sent me, at least partially, on my career. That sort of
Mm.
observation that she made.
That's fascinating. What does it look like in when you study it in adults outside of a college campus? What are some
Yeah.
examples?
So honestly, it's one of these things where once you study it, you see it all the time. And so where I see it the most is on social media where everybody is writing, "Oh, my child is valedictorian," and "Oh, we just went to Tahiti on a family vacation and loved each other the whole time," and "Oh, I just ran the Boston Marathon in under 3 hours again," and all these things where you're just like, "Oh my gosh," like everybody has these amazing lives with great careers and successful children and fabulous vacations. And that can make those of us who sometimes have struggled feel alone and isolated. And what's so interesting is that as soon as you sort of start thinking, wait, I have some bad stuff in my life and I'm not really talking about it on social media. All of a sudden, it's in fact very freeing because
Mm.
you all of a sudden identify that the norm is that you talk about the good stuff and you don't talk about the bad stuff. And so that sort of thing plays out all the time, that we talk about our wins, our successes, and we don't talk about struggles. And so, I think it's really, frankly, sort of a universal thing.
Uh, should we talk more about our struggles with each other? I don't know such that I don't know if I want to hear about other people's struggles. Is the thing.
So I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to say yes in part because everybody struggles. And what's the hardest is struggling when you're alone.
Hmm.
That,
Hmm.
it's only me. It's only me. And
Yeah.
so I think that to the extent that what feels the worst is when you're struggling and you're feeling alone. And there's a wonderful, I think it's a Swedish proverb that's something like, um, shared sorrow is half sorrow. Shared
Mm.
sorrow is half sorrow. And to me, that really feels like it really feels like fundamentally important. And I think it's also a universal thing that you can think about lots of different support groups, whether you talk about like AA. AA
Yeah.
works largely because you're with other people who are struggling with the same thing. It's why we have
Hmm.
grief support groups or cancer support groups, et cetera. And it's because when you're struggling with something, it actually feels much better to know that you're not alone, that other people have done this, other people have gotten through it. Your experience is not unique in that way.
Yeah. Though that makes a lot more sense. I was just feeling selfish, I guess.
No, but I think part of it is like it's not hearing people's struggles necessarily, just sort of taking on all of these struggles. But I think also sometimes hearing other people's struggles can put your own struggles in perspective,
Yeah.
right?
Well,
Like
it's
if
really
you
about
have
sharing the nature of being human together.
totally, absolutely, and that's really the idea, right? The nature of being human together. Yes.
Yeah. So, what can't we just say to people then? Oh, everyone feels this way. Why won't that just fix it?
Yeah. So I think it's because we have this universal tendency to sort of feel like we are different or we are unique in some way. So if you ask people, almost everybody feels, they're nicer, smarter, friendlier, than other people, et cetera. We sort of feel that we are unique, that there's something different about our own experience. And I think
Hmm.
to the extent that we can be more open and honest, and I guess I'm going to say authentic, that builds closer relationships. It lets you build closer relationships, and it lets you
Hmm.
feel, not so alone. So I told a story on social media a few months ago about running into a high school friend, had not seen her in a while, and she said, how are your kids doing? And I have three kids. This former high school friend also has three kids, and she goes, how are your kids doing? And I paused and I had a choice, right? So I could say, oh, they're great. Everything's great. This sort of easy, short thing. And what I said instead was, well, the good thing about having three kids is that even if one or two of them are struggling, you always can find someone that makes you feel good about yourself as a mom. And that's literally what I said. And then she goes, I totally get that. That's why I had three.
Mm.
And I was like, and it was a moment in which the easy thing would have been like, everything's good, everything's fine, oh yeah, they're doing well, blah, blah, blah. And I decided I just didn't want to do that. I just didn't want to do it. And so to me, that level of sort of authenticity, all of a sudden is saying like, hey, I'm trusting you. I'm opening up to you. I'm not going to do the artificial holiday card. Here's how we're all thriving. I'm going to rip
Mhm.
off the Band-Aid. And to me, I think there's some power in that.
Well, that seems very freeing too, because otherwise, if you say everybody's fine, I don't know about for me, I have the litany of all things that aren't fine first, right? Is that true? And it's sort of something I have to carry that I don't want to carry that.
Right, right. And so then, and that's exactly right. What you said is it's freeing because if you
Mm.
also are doing this, everything's fine, then you also are sort of hiding something. And that actually exerts more effort. There's a wonderful study by a professor at UVA, Dan Wagner, a psychologist, and he brings students into the lab and he says, just let your mind wander, think about anything you want, just let it go wherever it goes. And then he goes, just make sure you don't think about a white bear. Like, do not think about a white bear. And as soon as, of course, no one's thinking about a white bear, but as soon as you say that, you're like polar bear, white bear, it's all that's in your mind. And so I think it's also, that's what's freeing about being like, I'm going to lay it all out there, that other people then understand that. And you also become someone safe. You become someone that, she doesn't have to say, oh yeah, my kids are great too. She can say, I know exactly what you mean. That's why I had three. Again, it creates a level of authenticity and intimacy that I think really is freeing.
Well, and there's something about those social norms too, then that really aren't, that's not great for us. It's not great for us to say everything's fine because then it almost feels like a little lie.
Right.
And when we have those, they're things we have to carry. They're heavier.
Mhm.
And
The
if we
white
don't have to,
bear.
yep, that white bear. We got it. Oh, don't look at it. Don't look at it. Exactly. So I love that idea. Now, I would like to talk because you did condom use research, which makes me happy. So, tell me a little bit about that, the change behavior, norms. What was that research like?
Yeah, so I'm old enough that when I was in graduate school, there was a lot of concern about the AIDS epidemic. So again, that seems to me like now people are like, AIDS, is that still a thing? But when I was in graduate school, this was a really, really big thing, and
Mm,
there was lots and lots of concern about trying to reduce the infection of AIDS and the transmission of HIV, and in particular to try to increase condom use, overwhelmingly.
mm,
And so I did some of this work with college students, but I actually had the opportunity to spend a year working on a big study funded by NIH that was done at Emory University School of Public Health, in which we went into urban communities in which spread of HIV was relatively high. And what we did was we asked people, how do you feel about condom use? And then how do you think your partner feels about condom use? So
mm,
again, this is the same idea of my undergraduate student saying, how much do women care about their bodies, their, exercise, eating versus how much do you think other women do? And the thing that's
mm,
interesting about condom use, instead of, sunscreen use or getting a mammogram or even what you eat, is that condom use is inherently a dyadic experience, right? It's not
mm,
just that you
mm.
you don't do it alone, you do it with someone.
Yeah.
And so what's interesting is that many people were like, oh yeah, I'm in favor of condoms. Yeah, like I'm comfortable using them. I want to use them. Like I think it's important to use them. Et cetera. And then that we asked people, well, what do you think your partner feels? And what we found was that the likelihood of using condoms didn't so much wasn't influenced by people's own perception. It was what they thought their partner wanted. So
Mm,
that's a case in which it's sort of like the emperor's new clothes and that sort of famous, story that the little boy is like, everyone's naked. And everybody else is going like, oh yeah, that looks great. That with condom use, many people are in fact very positive about condom use, but they
mm,
think their partner won't be, and so they don't bring it up because they think
mm,
if they bring it up, their partner will think they're dirty or sleep around or whatever, some negative attribution. And so what's
mm,
so interesting is that changing that attribution about what their partners think about condom use actually increases condom use, and then it does so for men and it does so for women. And so that's an example about how sometimes we're wrong about social norms. And when you're wrong about social norms, correcting it and saying like, hey, you know what, a lot of people actually are much more positive about condom use than you might think, that actually leads to higher rates of safer sex.
that's fascinating and wonderful. And it also it goes back to the adage, You never should assume it'll make an ass out of you and me.
And absolutely, absolutely. And
Mm,
and that's a case, similarly, a follow-up that I did at Amherst of the research with my, student thinking that other women were more concerned about their bodies than they actually were. We actually did an experimental study telling half of the women, hey, you know what? Other women actually don't want to be as thin as you think they want to be, and they don't exercise as much and they eat more. And you're actually wrong. Many people are wrong about their perceptions. Simply telling first year college women that led to lower rates of disordered eating 6 months later. Just telling women you might have this belief. And so that's an example of how correcting misperceptions can be really helpful in terms of reducing the spread of sexually transmitted infections, can be really helpful in terms of reducing disordered eating, can make people feel better about themselves, all sorts of different things that correcting misperceptions can go a long way towards improving behavior.
well, I immediately need to make sure now that that isn't all of our first year programming,
Hmm.
because that is so key.
Hmm.
Um, and especially when under stress, we tend to find, I'm making this up. I tend to find when under stress that I compare myself more.
Hmm.
Um, and, and and so I can imagine other people would feel similarly. And
Hmm.
when your first year, you're stressed, so much change, it's going
Hmm.
to be more likely to all these
Hmm.
difficult things come up. Yes, I
Hmm.
love that. That's what you found. That's amazing.
Yeah.
Um, so I want to talk about this concept of moral courage, which you discussed in Why We Act. I love that. You said
Yes.
that,
Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yeah.
yeah, you said that deviating from a group activates something like a pain response, which is fascinating in the brain. Does that mean is moral courage always going to feel bad even when you know you're doing the right thing? What does that mean?
So it's such an interesting segue from our earlier conversation because when we think about moral courage, it actually relates also to social norms. And
Mhm,
that is that it is really hard to go against the group. We are
mhm,
hardwired to conform. We are hardwired to fit in. And there are lots of places in which that's good. We don't want to have a society in which there are stop signs and some people say that's a stop sign and some people say I don't have to stop for that sign, right? I mean, we want there to
mhm,
be social norms and that fitting in many cases is informative. It's why, you wear certain clothes to a wedding that are not the same that you wear to a 4th of July barbecue or whatever. So there are lots of ways in which fitting in is good. But the problem becomes there are times in which people are fitting in ways that are facilitating problematic behavior. And we can see lots of real world examples of this, things like hazing, in
mhm,
fraternities or athletic teams. We can see it in terms of bullying that happens in, high schools or even younger, sadly. And so there are some people, and I describe them in my book, Why We Act, as moral rebels, who have high levels of moral courage. And that means they are willing to stand up and say, hey, I don't agree with that, or hey, let's not do that. And these are people who feel not only comfortable doing it, but they almost feel like compelled to do it.
mhm,
And evidence is that it's probably about 10% of people or so, are really sort of comfortable doing that. And that means that there are a lot of people that recognize or see, ooh, that's kind of bad. Oh, that's a problem, but they don't feel comfortable saying it. So, I'm sure you've had this experience, many of your listeners, where there are times in which I've been sitting in a department meeting or a faculty meeting, and somebody says something that I see as problematic. And sometimes I speak up, but sometimes I don't. And that's an example of any time that I've spoken up, anytime I've said, hey, I just want to circle back to that. Like you probably didn't, mean it this way, but sometimes or that can kind of imply, or maybe you want to think about your words or something. Whenever I've said that, sometimes nobody in the meeting supports me or says anything, but invariably people walk past me in the hall and they say like, hey, I'm really glad that you said that. Or I get an email from someone, hey, I was thinking the exact same thing, thank you so much. Because I think part of the issue is that it can feel scary to stand up and defy a group. It can feel scary to be the only person in a room or a meeting saying like, yeah, don't love that. But that's really what moral courage is. It's being willing to speak up, to say this isn't right, even when there might be consequences for doing so.
I think that's the thing. There are consequences,
Hmm.
and some of them are imaginary. We
Hmm.
make them up, but it's the fear of the consequences, I
Hmm.
think. And sometimes they're very real.
Hmm.
In workplace, going against it. Um, How do we navigate that? The consequences versus doing what we should
Mhm.
morally.
Yeah. So what and this is a topic that is near and dear to my heart and I talk about a lot. And what I always say is it's not one size fits all. So I think having a repertoire of different responses is most helpful. So for example, it might feel different speaking up at a meeting in the workplace than it does if you're on public transportation and hear somebody use a racist or
Mm,
homophobic or sexist slur. It might be different if you're talking about attending Thanksgiving dinner with your family versus if you are in some other setting. So I think it's
mhm,
important to have a repertoire of different responses. So that's number one. I think number two, there often are ways to speak up that don't mean that you speak up and say you're stupid or you're racist or
mhm,
you're lazy or you're wrong. So speaking up and saying like, hey, you know what? It's probably just me and maybe I'm too sensitive, or you probably meant it as a joke but some people might hear it, or I know that you didn't mean it but maybe we should probably not use the term girls versus women, or whatever it is. So there are ways that you can speak up that are owning it, that aren't making the person feel bad or stupid. I also think there are times and this is especially true in the workplace, but it can also be true in on public transportation, in which speaking up is risky for the person. So maybe you're in a workplace and your boss is continually saying something problematic or using bad judgment. Maybe you can't call out your boss, but maybe you can talk to a friend, or maybe you can
mhm,
go with somebody else and report it. I had a time in my department in which somebody in my department was doing something kind of problematic in terms of ethics and college funding. And my secretary noticed it. My administrative assistant noticed it. She didn't feel comfortable saying it because, she did not have a lot of power, but she told me, and I was able to resolve it without getting her
mhm,
involved. And so that's an example. I read a wonderful thing, I think it was on X, about somebody who was in Boston on a train in which there were some people, she was a woman, and there were some young men sort of taunting her, teasing her, sort of making
mhm.
her feel uncomfortable. And a total stranger went over and sat down beside her and said, "Oh, hey, are you going to this party? I don't know. I don't know if Bob's going to be there, whatever." And then ended up getting off the train with that woman. So that's an example. The stranger didn't say to the guy, "Shut up," didn't call 911, didn't whatever, but just went over and sat with the person. And so I think it's not one size fits all, but I think there are
Mhm.
lots of times that we have options about what to do or say.
That makes a lot of sense, a lot. Now, can we train this? What does the research say actually works to train moral courage as opposed to what we assume works, like, appealing to someone's character or their values or.
Yeah. So some of the most interesting work that I've been involved in over the last few years emanated from an op-ed that I wrote following George Floyd's murder. And I wrote an op-ed that appeared in USA Today, and it was really about changing the culture within police departments. And this is based on some longstanding work of a group called ABLE, Active Bystandership and Law Enforcement, that runs out of Georgetown University Law. And they actually use the ABLE program in Boston, by the way. Uh, and so I wrote an op-ed about George Floyd's murder. And here's, as a social psychologist, what I observed in watching that horrific footage. And that is that one person, Derek Chauvin, knelt on George Floyd's neck. But there were three other officers with him. And here's the reality. Derek Chauvin was a bad cop. That's clear. But if the other three people had done what they were supposed to do, drag
Mhm.
Derek Chauvin off of George Floyd's neck, George Floyd would be alive today and he'd be living and working and walking around Minneapolis and we wouldn't know who he was. And that's an example of a problematic social norm, in that those three officers, and admittedly, two of them were young, one of them had been trained by Derek Chauvin. I mean, lots of stuff came out. But that's an example of, if those three officers had stepped up and did what they were supposed to do legally, ethically, and morally, their careers would be ongoing and George Floyd would be alive. And that's what I wrote in USA Today. And then, because I wrote this, I was asked to be on the board of the ABLE program at Georgetown Law. And I now am working actively on research with that program to basically examine, does changing police culture by talking about exactly what you and I have talked about in this call. Um,
Mm,
hey, lots of officers think it's problematic to use excessive force or to plant evidence or to, rough up a subject or whatever. Like lots of officers believe that. But if they don't think that other officers believe it, they don't speak up because they don't want to face the
mm,
consequences of being the tattletale or the whistleblower, et cetera. And so what ABLE does is it goes into police departments and it talks about social psychology and social norms and misperceiving norms. And
mm,
and that's how I think we can change the culture of police departments, just like we can change the culture of hospitals. Lots of work has been done in hospital settings in which for years, if a surgeon was making a mistake, nurses and residents who were lower in power wouldn't say anything, even when
mm.
surgeons made errors. In the 1970s, there were a number of high profile plane crashes in which pilots made errors, captains made errors, and co pilots didn't feel comfortable calling out their problematic behavior, even when they're on a plane with the pilot making the bad decision. And so all of this is about how do we change culture in locker rooms, on school buses, in police departments, in boardrooms, in Congress, in police
Mm.
departments, and so on.
That's absolutely phenomenal. I love that 'cause that seems one of the keys to making, well, a happier, better world is understanding what we really think and not assuming what other people think. I
Mhm.
love that. I never thought about it through that lens. So thank you and that way for showing all of us um, how that works. It's phenomenal. Let's move a little bit to the positive shift, though, mindset. So positive shift argues that mindset affects not just how we feel, but also like measurable health outcomes and even longevity. So what's the strongest evidence for that claim and where does the evidence get shakier? What does that look like?
Yeah. So it's obviously impossible to randomly assign people to be more or less optimistic, right?
Mm,
You can't do it. And yet, lots of research has examined different personality traits, different mindset shifts, and how those actually predict health outcomes and how those even predict longevity. One of my favorite examples was done with women who cleaned hotel rooms. This was literally their job.
mm,
These were all women who cleaned hotel rooms. And half of the women, they said, hey, it's really important to exercise, 3 to 5 times a week, 75 minutes at a time, et cetera. And half of the women, they said that exact same thing, really important to exercise 3 to 5 times a week, et cetera. And then they added the following. And by the way, cleaning hotel rooms counts as exercise. So if you're vacuuming
mm.
or, changing sheets or, whatever, that all counts as exercise. So that's all the study did. Told some of the women, told everybody you have to exercise, but told some other women, this counts what you're doing. They went back to these women a month later, all the women, and the women who'd been told, by the way, cleaning hotel rooms counts as exercise, had lost weight, had lower body fat, and had lower blood pressure. Now, isn't
That's
that
crazy.
fascinating? Yeah,
Yeah.
and that's all they did. All they did was say, by the way, what you're doing counts. That's all they did. So that's not a full answer to your question about, how does this predict longevity, but it's an example about how informing people of something probably changed their mindset. Oh, I thought I was going to have to find all this time to exercise, but in fact, I'm doing it right now. Or maybe it led them to clean more vigorously, and that led them to, again, get more exercise. Maybe they then said, hey, you know what? I'm already exercising. Maybe I should also change my diet or do other things. But it's an example about how tweaking somebody's thought patterns, tweaking somebody's perceptions can lead to measurable changes in their health.
How- I love that. And I love it because the the women who were told, the cleaners that, hey, you're already exercising, that seems like fun and liberating. Other ones like you just gave me more job after my job cleaning hotel rooms.
Right. How am I
Ugh.
going to find the time? How am I going to find the money? You're actually like adding stress.
Yes.
How is this going to happen? Yeah, that's exactly right. Yeah.
I love it. I want someone to do that with all aspects of my life now. So how do we do that? How do we help people shift their mindsets? Because that's the hard part. I've tried with so many people and they look at me like, you idiot. I have to hang on to this anger. You know?
Um, so another, again, a really simple study, and this one, I've shared very recently with my newly graduated from college daughter. This is a study in which they told some people stress is bad for you, stress is debilitating for health, exactly the things we hear all the time, right? Avoid stress, etc. The other people, they said stress is invigorating. It's
Hmm.
energizing. People do their best work when they're sort of, pushed, et cetera. And it keeps you active and excited and engaged, et cetera. And it's really, in fact, good. It provides a spark. So my daughter had a job interview a few weeks ago, and she said, I'm really nervous. And she goes, I'm really nervous. I'm really stressed. And I said, you're really energized and excited.
Mm.
And then she was like, oh, right. And that's an example. It's also what elite athletes do, right? Elite athletes don't think like, oh, here's all this pressure. I'm at the Olympic trials. They think this is thrilling. This is exciting. I'm getting to perform on the highest stage. So we all have this opportunity to do this little mindset tweak and to sort of reframe. How do we think about challenges that we're facing? How do we put a positive spin on them? How do we think about what is possible and what is good in the situation instead of what is bad?
The social norms could be so strong because the minute you said that, that stress is actually invigorating. My brain said bullshit right back at you.
Right, because we hear all the time, right? We hear all the time that stress is deadly, that stress is so awful, et cetera. But there's a really interesting book that I recommend all the time. It's by a neuroscientist at Stanford, and it's called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers.
That's a wonderful title.
It's a wonderful title, isn't it? And the reason, of course, is that zebras only react physiologically. Lots of stress, heart, beating fast, muscles, tense, rapid breathing when they're, being chased by a lion, like when there
Mm.
actually is a life and death. Guess when humans do it? All the
Right,
time, right?
always.
Always, right? Always. I've got a lot of emails in my inbox. I'm late for my train. I've got a blind date. I've got a job interview. But
Every
again,
ding of the phone, ding, ding, ding.
every ding of the phone, every ding of,
Mm,
I've got so much on my to-do list. But none of that is like being chased by a lion, right? I mean, so
mm.
and that is it's not life or death. It's not life or death. And so again, I'm not saying, and let me be clear, and as you just said, well, that's bullshit or whatever. I'm not saying it's easy to be like, "So, I'm just gonna do it, whatever. But I think the key is that people who are naturally optimistic, which I am not, like I am not an optimistic, hopeful person. I am somebody who can easily go into the dire and the doom and the gloom. And
Same, same.
well, maybe
Constantly. It takes an
that's
effort.
why. No, but here's the thing. That's why you're doing this because honestly, you couldn't do this podcast if you were super optimistic because it would just be like, well, it's just breathing. Like there's nothing to it. Like, there would be nothing to talk about for you, right?
Yeah.
Because it would just be like, this is like I exhale and I inhale. There's nothing to learn here. And so what's so interesting is that for people who are not naturally happy, it is like an effort. It's like an effort. It takes energy. It takes practice to get good at it.
Yes. It takes diligence too, and it takes knowing yourself and
Hmm.
knowing the patterns of thoughts and paying attention. And I think
Hmm.
that step, at least, in what I've seen, is the one that's missing. People don't actually take time to really know.
Right.
And that's why psychology matters so much.
Oh my
So
gosh, so
much.
much, right? Yeah.
So is there a mindset shift from your research that you've actually had trouble applying to your own life?
So I will say that, as I said before, I'm not a naturally happy person.
Mhm.
I'm someone who has, family history of, addiction and substance abuse issues, anxiety disorders, depression. I've lost, two relatives, first and second degree relatives to suicide. I mean, so I'm someone who probably naturally is hardwired to not be particularly happy. And so I guess what, for me, working and talking and thinking about happiness has been a constant reminder to me of the things that I have to do. That happiness for me is not going to come easily. It's not going to come easily. It's not going to come magically. It does involve effort. And so, therefore, I deliberately do things like I schedule dinner parties because I know that I will feel stressed, preparing and shopping and cleaning my baseboards and whatever, but I will be happy catching up with those people. I plan
Mhm.
trips because I know that when I am traveling, I feel freer. I feel,
Mhm.
excited and engaged, et cetera. I make a point of exercising. I don't love exercising, but I love having exercised. Um,
Same.
you know, again, so I deliberately do things in my life where I'm like, this is important to do. This is important to do. And there are things where I'm like, well, I don't really have the time to do that. I make the time for it because I
Mm.
know that if I don't, it's going to be bad for me.
Same. That's like same, same. Everything you said. Oh, yep. Understand it. Understand it.
Yeah.
So you write a weekly newsletter distilling research into practical strategies, which I love, of course.
Yeah.
What's a piece of advice you gave early on that you'd now revise?
Ooh, what's a piece of advice that I've given early on that I've now revised? Honestly, I can't think of anything. I can't think of anything because all of the things so again, I've been doing this for, it'll be nearly 2 years. I started in September of 2024. So it'll be nearly 2 years. And all of the piece of advice that I've given are research based. So that it's not just
Mhm.
my opinion. It's some a tidbit or two or whatever of research. Now, I will say that some of them resonate with me more than others. So when
Mm,
I'm writing about them, some of them I'm like, this is near and dear to my heart. And some of them I'm like, this will be helpful to some people, even not so much for me. But I think that's the sort of distinction, is that happiness is not one size fits all. So I
mm,
talk and write about happiness a lot. And I guess my favorite example, and maybe this is a long answer to your question, I actually haven't written about this yet, is that I do not meditate. So I do not meditate. I think I would be lousy at meditating. Meditating does not resonate with me. I can't even imagine. I can imagine, in fact, meditating making me stressed. But I recognize that the empirical research says meditation is very good for psychological well-being. It's very good for physical well-being. Some research actually suggests it makes you kinder and nicer. So, like, that's an example of something that I know the research. I know that it is good. I know that lots of people find it helpful, and it is empirically supported by scientific data. And I do not do it because it does not resonate with me. And so one of the reasons why I do this How to Feel Better newsletter is I'm writing, 52 pieces of advice a
mhm.
year. And my hope is that some weeks people will be like, "Man, that's kind of a swing and a miss. This does not resonate." And then other weeks people will be like, "Oh my gosh, you're talking to me." And those will be different for different people.
Yeah, I love that. And I also love that you don't meditate because otherwise we always feel like to be happy if we it's a work, we have to do all the things perfectly. And we don't. We have to do
Right.
what works for us and
Right.
in our life. I love
Right.
that. Now, if someone listening wants to close the gap between what they assume everyone around them thinks and what's actually true, what's like a lowest effort place they can start?
Yeah, so I would say the lowest effort place they can start is if you have, someone in your life who you feel close to, taking the risk of sort of having an authentic, moment, whatever that is.
Mm,
And so that could be, I'm really struggling with this. That could be, this is, I'm really worried about, my child or my job or, this thing that's going on. I think the thing that's also so interesting is that as soon as you start sharing something that's going bad, that maybe it feels a little bit, risky or whatever, you get lots of support. So anytime that I have shared, something challenging that I'm going through, people have been like, you know what? I have a friend who went through something very similar, or I have this other person, and let me put you in touch with them. And that has all been, very, very freeing, and frankly, I think has
mm.
strengthened my close relationships.
Yes, I love it. That's excellent advice. And I had similar experience when I've done that, and I don't regret it.
Hmm. It feels hard, right? Because
Yes.
it feels vulnerable, and I think it really feels hard, to be vulnerable in that way. I remember, and I'm saying this with his permission. My oldest son is now about to be 28, but when he was in high school, he struggled a lot, and he struggled enough that he like literally nearly failed his Spanish class. Like he had like an F in Spanish, and whenever I told that story about my son getting an F in Spanish in like a keynote address, everybody would sort of gasp, like, like she's literally sharing that her son is failing Spanish. And and it struck me as so interesting that it felt so vulnerable for other people hearing me say this. And yet so many people resonated with like it being a relief that somebody said something that was not, my children are
The
perfect,
best ever.
the best ever. That I was literally like, yeah, my kid is totally, totally failing Spanish. And it was interesting because it just felt to me like, yeah, he is failing Spanish and it's really stressful to me. And I'm worried about him and if he's going to make it through high school, et cetera. But I think that that sort of level of authenticity really resonates with lots of people because we don't live in a world in which lots of people are authentic. We live in a world in which people use, fillers and, show their,
Mhm.
fabulous picture of Santorini on their Instagram and all of this good stuff. Here's my fabulous meal and, here's me, whatever. And all of this, it's like on LinkedIn, I'm so proud to announce that I've been named the whatever, and I think all of that makes people feel if they're struggling with something that it's just them and they're alone and everybody else has these fabulous lives and families and kids and careers and whatever.
Yeah, and especially when it comes to our children, we're doing them a disservice by pretending that they're not human like the rest of us. They're not going to
Hmm.
have struggles like the rest of
Hmm.
us. Doesn't mean we have to share them without permission or do anything that would embarrass the child, but just acknowledging that, hey, this child's growing up being a human, and that's hard, and they're going to
Yeah.
screw up sometimes, and that's
Yeah.
okay.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, and I see it, and I'm sure you see it, way more in your role as a dean, but I see it a lot with students who arrive at college and,
Mhm.
they've been used to being like the best at everything, and here they are getting into this selective college, and like all of a sudden they're like everybody else here finds everything easy and whatever. And I talk a lot with my when I teach intro to psychology to first years about how lots of people are struggling. And if you don't understand what I'm saying and you raise your hand, I guarantee you are going to ask a question that most people in this room have that same question and they're just too
Mhm.
scared to ask. And that's an example again of social norms, right? That you think, oh, I have a question, but I'm the only one and everybody else here is really smart. And the reality is, no, everyone else is just too scared to raise their hand.
Yeah. And I think a key too is remembering that everybody else around you is also just a human being,
Hmm.
right? And
Hmm.
and we forget that.
Hmm.
Now, I only have two more questions.
Yeah.
This one, what's a question about your own work that you wish more interviewers asked and never do?
Well, I mean, you've asked so many wonderful questions. I'm even like trying to think about something. I guess what I like most about my work, and we've actually touched on lots of this today, is that I think lots of people in academia, and you, I'm sure, see this a lot, they do their work in academia, but it only is reached by other people in like their narrowest little area.
Yeah.
And so the question that I like the most, and some people do ask it, but basically is why does your work matter? Why does your work matter? And so you and I in the course of this conversation have talked about HIV prevention and pregnancy prevention and condom use, and we've talked about disordered eating, and we've talked about moral courage and police
Mhm.
departments, and hazing and bullying, and all of that to me is why psychology really matters. That I'm not just doing this to have a career where I can publish things that are read by other people with PhDs who study this little narrow, niche social norms kinds of things. And the work that I find the most rewarding is frankly work in which the tangible outcomes. So you at some point in this call said, "Well, I've got to make sure we talk about this at first year orientation." Yes.
Mhm. Yeah.
And that's exactly right. So, Why We Act was chosen as a first year reads, by a school in Minnesota, by Winona State, and I went out there last year and talked to the two incoming freshmen. They all read it as part of their read, and I was like, yes, that's why I did it. So when these students are at a fraternity party, or in some situation where they see somebody unconscious or they see some sexual assault or whatever, that they will speak up, and that's my goal is that my work isn't just being read or talked about by academics, but it's actually helping to change the world in ways that make people happier,
Mm.
more likely to speak out in the presence of bad behavior, because we all want to live in a world in which people are happier and kinder and call out problematic behavior. That's the world we all want to live
Preaching, just speaking to my soul here, because
in.
that's exactly as an English professor, I was like, I can't just study why this word is a symbol for something. It
Hmm.
has to be a purpose, right? How can we change the world? Which is how I ended
Yeah.
up in happiness. How can we
Yeah.
make things better? Otherwise, it's just not as fun,
Hmm.
too. It's not as useful. The
Yeah.
last question's my favorite. You get to add a song to the Happy You Asked playlist. Any song you would
Oh,
like.
oh, oh. Let's see. Um, I'm like super torn now. But I will say, I gave a talk pretty recently, and they chose the walk up music, and the walk up music was golden. You know that news.
Ah,
Yes, and I loved that, and it made me happy. And I was like, it's a happy song, it's a happy message, and so I'm going to go with that, golden.
I love that, and it is a wonderful song. Dr. Sanderson, you have been amazing and have made me happy talking to you. I feel better just having done it.
Well, I have so enjoyed this conversation, so thank you for reaching out, and let's stay connected.
All right. And thank you everyone for listening. Until next time. Bye.